Afternoon, and welcome to Winston Churchill, probably one of the most popular of any British subject. He held a variety of political offices: Home Secretary, First Sea Lord, local politician. He was with the colonial department, oversaw the colonies. He'll be prime minister twice. 1939, 1940, 1945, again in 1951 and 1955, although in his second stint as prime minister, he'll have a stroke, and he won't be quite as effective here. But he'll stay in Parliament after his second tour as prime minister. And of course, he dies January 24, 1965, at the age of 90. He is born into the Duke of Marlborough family, which is a derivative of the noble Spencer family. His full name will be Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill. Churchill, George Spencer, his ancestor, took the surname Churchill and added it to Spencer. And that seems to have gone on ever since, and that was back in 1817. His father became the 7th Duke of Marlborough. His father's name was Randolph. In fact, Winston Churchill is going to write a 2-volume history of his father. His father was heavily involved in the British government. But he will be born on November 30, 1874. And he'll be born in Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire, England. Now, having said that, he really won't have a relationship with his father. A lot of being upper crust, he's really under the tutelage of a governess. His mother, who came from the Jerome family in the United States. She, by the way, Jenny Jerome is her name. Her father was Leonard Jerome, who was a millionaire, by the way. Hence the name, Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill. She, by the way, is an interesting character. She was a socialite, but she didn't interact with young Winston as much either. In fact, he's between the ages of 2 and 6. His grandfather was actually viceroy in Ireland, and his father was actually the undersecretary. So they lived in Ireland, in Dublin, for 4 years, at least 4 years between the ages when he was 2 to 6. And his brother will be born there. His brother's name is John Strange Spencer Churchill. What a name, Strange. John Strange Spencer Churchill. The person he's really close to at a young age is his governess, Mrs. Elizabeth Ann Everest. And she's not only his governess, she's his confidant, she's his teacher, she's his playmate. And when she died, when he was 21 years old, he dropped what he was doing and went back to be with her when she was dying. And he even writes that she was probably the best friend he had, the real intimate of his life for the first 20 years of his life. Interesting how, and like I said, his father, he never really had a real working relationship with his father. Winston was not the most model student. You wouldn't think so with his command of the English language. He gravitates to that. He goes to 3 different grammar schools, and he winds up at the Harrow School in April 17, 1888. And he's 14 years old at this point, going on 14 years old at this point. And when he gets to school, he joins the Harrow Rifles. Early on, he's drawn to military traditions, ceremony, and trappings. He used to see the military parades as a young lad in Ireland. The British occupation forces. He used to see the parades there in Ireland. but he's drawn to the military. He also is supposed to be afforded with a stutter and a lisp. The Winston Churchill Museum said that him having a stutter was actually false, but not a lisp. He did have one. And later on, he will want to make sure that when his dentures are put into his mouth, that it does something about the lisp. But he always had, Humphrey Bogart had a lisp. Some people don't, and he got that in the Navy in 1917. He got hit in the mouth when someone opened a bulkhead door, and he got bashed in the mouth. So he always had that lisp, but it didn't hurt him as an actor. Probably made him more popular with the way he used to talk. But Churchill too, is gone through history having had a so-called speech impediment. There are people who have overcome stuttering and have gone on to lead interesting lives. But Churchill really was known for his lisp. When he went to Harrow, interesting, he took the test, and his highest score was mathematics, not one of his stalwart, not really one of his assets. But when he got to Harrow, he was in among the lowest of the classes because his marks in schools prior, the grammar schools, were not all that great, although he does gravitate to history. And later on, when he's prime minister, and he does come here in December going into January of 1941-42, after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and the United States is into the war, he will come here and spend 3 weeks, going on 4 at the White House as the guests of the Roosevelts. And it's then at this point where he makes, if you've ever seen it, you can find it on YouTube, he makes one of the greatest speeches ever to the United States Congress. It's a wonderful speech to watch. But he used to regale Franklin D. Roosevelt late into the night about British history, world history itself, politics. And Franklin D. Roosevelt was enamored with this. But there's one problem. Franklin D. Roosevelt was not the healthiest person on the planet. And Eleanor Roosevelt would get pretty angry. What's wrong with Winston? Doesn't he know that Franklin can't stay up late? And Franklin D. Roosevelt's trying to stay up at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning, while Churchill is having his occasional brandy, smoking his Havana cigar, and going on and on and on, and just won't stop. So he comes to the United States, and that won't be the last time he comes to the United States. But having said that, that's down the road. Having said that, at the Harrow School, he hated Harrow. He hated going to the school. And he asked his mother, he wrote letters to his mother, why don't you come visit me? Why don't you get me out of here and bring me home? His father forget. His father, again, he never really had that close working relationship. And his father's going to die in 1895 at age 45 years old. And Churchill's going on 21. He's just over 20. It was January 1895. And so he never really had that working relationship with his father. And his mother, it's sparse, on and off. But he still has Mrs. Everett, who was his closest family relation, really, if you want to call it that. Later on, when he goes to get married, he meets this Clementine Hosier in 1904 at the Crewe House, the home of the Earl of Crewe. They meet in 1904. They really don't get together again until 1908, and they're at a party of this lady St. Helier. And they sit down together and they strike up a conversation and they really hit it off. Leads to a romance. And he proposes to her in August of 1908. They get married on September 12, 1908. And they will have a number of children. They'll have Diana, they'll have Randolph. They'll have two other daughters by the time the war is over with. Although the fourth child, the third daughter, Marigold, she develops a cold here, and she dies in 1921. They will have another daughter in 1924, and that'll be the end of the litter. But again, just like interesting here from a family perspective, just like he had the relationship with his father, and just like the relationship with his mother, the Churchill kids, of course, by this time, Winston's all over the place, in and out of government, in the military, out of the military as a correspondent. He's rarely ever home. But Mrs. Churchill they had a governess watching the children. So even here, with this next generation, they weren't quite as close to the kids. And that seemed to be, I guess, to a certain extent, part of the culture here. When you're busy representing your country in government or in the military, or in Churchill's case, at times when he was in the military as well as being a correspondent, you're rarely ever home. And when you are home, how long are you home? And so you don't spend a lot of time with the children, and they have 5 children, one of which died. Their marriage will be successful. They will never divorce. They will live together. They'll until they die. But with the children, no, they never seemed to have that closeness of family. I mean, another one here was what? The Roosevelts. I'm talking about Franklin and Eleanor. And Eleanor admitted she had 6 children, but she admitted having children is a chore. She also was not a big fan of sex, and she thought she was not cut out for motherhood. Yet at the same time, this is a lady who, if you came to her with a sob story, I lost my job, I lost my apartment, I don't have enough clothes, she'd give you the jacket off her back. Yet at the same time, she feels she's not geared for motherhood. Interesting psychological aspects going on here. When Churchill left the School of Harrow in 1893, he applied to attend at the Royal Military College at Sandhurst. He flunked the entrance exam 3 times before he made it on the 4th. Now this is a problem with Churchill. One of the reasons he wouldn't be accepted at schools of higher learning, he did not learn the classics, the Greek and Roman classics, Greek and Latin classics. He didn't learn that, and he admits this later on. But at the same time here, and that's interesting too, because when you go back before Churchill, you look back at a lot of your founding fathers, they were schooled in Latin and Greek classics, in rhetoric, in music, in science. They were well-rounded. Churchill, by the way, will be a non-academic historian. He won't have that PhD, but then again, what he knows, who cares? A PhD really wouldn't have meant anything. He knows history as it is. In fact, to the extent that in 1953, he will be given a Nobel Prize for literature, not for any one work in particular, but for that conglomeration of works. It's one of those Oscars they give an actor for a life. It's like a lifetime achievement award. Yet, if you've ever read Churchill, and I urge you to do so if you're really interested in Churchill, I have a number of his volumes right off to the right here. He had a marvelous command of the English language. And whether you like the man or not, he's a joy to read. Just like Thomas Jefferson, whether you like the man or not, he's a joy to read because of that command of the English language. I always remember when Thomas Jefferson wrote this. And, when I get in these talks about revolution, and I always bring up what Mao once wrote, that, political power comes from the barrel of a gun. Or you go to Lenin, who said along the lines, people who are adverse to learning the art of firearms deserve to be slaves. Then there's Thomas Jefferson. The tree of liberty is watered with the blood of patriots and tyrants. See the difference there? That command of the language, it's absolutely marvelous. Marvelous. Well, anyway, he joins, but he can't. His father wants him to join the infantry when, you know, the infantry, the people studying infantry at Sandhurst. He opts for the cavalry. Why? Because it's educationally not as onerous here. Because he didn't take he didn't go the classics, so he stays with the cavalry. And even though he graduates 8th out of 150, 8th out of 150, that's not bad. His father feels now's the time he can gravitate to the infantry. No, he stays with the cavalry. And he will, by the way, join the, he'll be, later on, he joins the 4th Hussars. And in 1941, when he's prime minister, he's named an honorary regimental colonel in the 4th Hussars. He'll be given that, but he stays with the cavalry. However, interestingly enough, now he gets, you know, he's going to be given a salary here of £300 a year as a young lieutenant. He feels he needs more money than that to maintain the lifestyle, because some of the others come from rich families and are getting more money. So he petitions his mother for more money. He would like £500 more a year from his mother. She cuts him at 400, and he'll have to deal with it, and that's the end of that. However, this is what one historian noted that, or was, I think it was, I forgot the historian's name now, who mentioned that this is why Churchill gravitated to being a correspondent, because this way he can get into combat zones, whether he's in uniform or not, and he can write about what he's seeing. And the first place he goes to is Cuba in 1895. Keep in mind, he's 21 years old. He's now still in the Army, but he's not only being a correspondent. Actually, as a young officer in the British Army, he's seeing how insurgents work. Keep in mind, this is not the War of 1898 yet. He's watching how the Spanish Army deals with insurgents, and this is the first time he gets shot at. It's in Cuba he gets shot at. Probably the first of, some historians estimate, 50 times he'd been shot at. This was the first time. Of course, it's here that he develops that desire to smoke Havana cigars, which he will do for the rest of his life. And he writes glowingly about his time in Cuba. He enjoyed his time in Cuba. India. In 1896, he's transferred to Bombay, India. And here, interestingly enough, he was jumping off the boat, you know, when he gets to India, and he wrenched his arm. Now, he was considered one of the best polo players in his regiment. He will now have to play polo, and I don't know how you do this, but supposedly play polo with his upper arm strapped to his body while he's playing polo. That seems pretty, you might have to have intestinal fortitude for that one. But he meets a girl here that he really begins to like. And this is before he meets his wife. Her name is Pamela Plowden. She's the daughter of one of the, she's a daughter of one of the civil servants in colonial India. He also writes, as he's writing here, he also writes how many of these ladies who were wives of British civil servants in India, they're nasty. They have these self-effacing opinions of themselves as real beauties. They have a highfalutin attitude towards themselves, and he found it disgusting. And he writes about this glowingly, and I'm sure that didn't enamor him in certain quarters. But at the same time here, he begins to, in his off time, and he begins to read a lot of books. For instance, he reads Gibbon's series on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. He reads Macaulay's History of England, and he picked up a book, and I think I'm going to find this book and read it. Winford Reddy's work, The Martyrdom of Man. Keep in mind, Churchill later becomes a proponent of eugenics. Interesting where Churchill goes in his life here. Interesting where he goes. He also, with this book, I found this fascinating, his book, this Martyrdom of Man. It's an interesting here what I found. He writes to his mother, interesting, to his mother that it's his critique of religion. Now pay attention to this one. Confirmed what he had reluctantly come to believe. Churchill believed that religion, although mostly not literally true, was a useful crutch until men were ready to rely on reason alone. He wrote his old headmaster, James Weldon, now the Bishop of Calcutta, he opposes Christian missions in India. Churchill urged that the state was perfectly entitled, get this, to dictate the doctrines of the established church in England, and advocated non-denominational teaching in the schools by secular teachers, and that includes teaching the Bible. Interesting. Interesting man, Mr. Churchill here. His mother, though, also used to send him, so he could read these on his off time, all the parliamentary debates that were going on. You know, he's not in England, he's in India. So his mother would send him all these parliamentary debates. He would read these parliamentary debates and also make notes of what he agreed with, what he disagreed with, what they should have done, what they didn't do. And so it's almost like he's priming himself to become a member of parliament here by reading these parliamentary debates. He wanted to go to the Greco-Turkish War in 1897, but he winds up remaining in colonial India. In fact, he understands that a force is being moved into the Northwest frontier territories, which, if you're acquainted with colonial India, hence Pakistan and Afghanistan, that is still one of the most lawless areas of the globe. And when the British formulated the Durand Line, which supposedly separated Afghanistan from in colonial India, which now is the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, the people that live along that line, many of those people, what border? They just go back and forth as if there is no border. And it's lawless, especially in the frontier, in the Northwest frontier territories. Gun smuggling, drug smuggling, people smuggling, you name it, it's wide open here. They make Capone look like a little choir boy up in this area of Pakistan. And so they are he's going to join a force that's going to go there and first of all, reconnaissance. He, by the way, will join the commander of the 2nd Brigade, a General Jeffrey. And Churchill is assigned to a reconnaissance squadron of 15 riders. Keep in mind, he's trained as a cavalryman. And they get into a fight with some tribesmen in the mountains. And this fight lasts an hour until they're relieved by the 35th elements of the 35th Sikh Regiment. And after a while, the fighting dies down. General Jeffrey's regiment catches up, and they continue on. And then there's hundreds of tribesmen in the mountains waiting for them. And they all open up. And the fighting is pretty fierce here, Churchill states. And he noticed as they were beginning to give ground, there were 4 soldiers carrying an officer. The firing was so bad, these soldiers could no longer carry that officer and had to duck for cover. Churchill watched. There was nothing he could do. Churchill watched one of the tribesmen come down and hack this wounded British officer in the stretcher. And he said, for the first time in my life, I just wanted to kill somebody just to kill somebody. And so now he's really indoctrinated in a thing called war. He will eventually leave India, And he goes home, and he actually writes a book. It's his first book, The Story of the Malacan Field Force in 1898, to which he received a total of 600 pounds. And then what he does is he goes to the Sudan. He will be assigned to the Sudan, and here he's going to meet two captains. Well, he'll meet Douglas Haig when he's a captain, who later becomes General Haig in command of British troops on the Western Front in the First World War. He also will be under the command of General Herbert Kitchener. Lord Kitchener, later on again, another man of fame here in the British Armed Forces. And he also writes a 2-volume work of his experiences in the Sudan. It's called The Two River War, and it's a 2-volume work. And that came out he started to write this October 1898, and it will come out in 1899. It's also here, by the way, that he gets out of the British Army on May 5, 1899. Now, he's only going on 25 years old, but he gets out of the British Army. But he'll be back in the Army too. But as a correspondent, he goes to South Africa. And in South Africa, he's writing about the Boer War. And he's writing for the Morning Post newspaper. And he's getting a salary, get this, of 250 pounds a month. That's pretty good money. And interesting, he's also captured by the Boers after he was on an armored train, and supposedly because of his actions trying to help his fellow British soldiers on the train. Of course, he's a civilian at this point, but helping British soldiers, and he's nominated for the Victoria Cross, which is a military decoration, probably because he had been in the military, but he's no longer in the military. He will not get a Victoria Cross. They can't give it to somebody who's non-military. That's reserved. That's their version of our Congressional Medal of Honor. So they're not going to give him that. But he winds up in a prison, but he escapes, and he marches some 300 miles to Portuguese East Africa, where he escapes. And he's somewhat of a darling in the public with his exploits here. He will stay in South Africa and join the South African Light Horse. And he is among the first British troops into Ladysmith and Pretoria. And with his cousin, the Duke of Marlborough, interesting, they are able to get ahead of the troops into Pretoria. And they demand and get the surrender of 52 Boer soldiers who were on guard at a prison camp, the two of them. Sounds like the Sergeant York story all over again. But again, he retires from the regular army. And, his political career, he runs for several offices on a local scale. Oldham in England, he represents Oldham in Parliament. He represents other towns. But then again, he leaves the Conservative Party and he joins the Liberals. Churchill is interesting from the perspective, and I have this here, Churchill as a member of the Dundee constituency. And as president of the Board of Trade, he was appointed by Lloyd George, who will later be the Prime Minister of England for part of the First World War. Interesting what Lloyd George is opposing the First Lord of the Admiralty, and his name was Reginald McKenna, from building a lot of dreadnought battleships. Churchill joins with Lloyd George, wanting to curtail the expenditure and spend more money at home. In fact, Churchill draws up a trade boards bill setting up the first minimum wages in England. He also, by the way, helps to draft the first unemployment legislation in England. Fascinating. And he's also interested in eugenics. I mentioned that earlier. He also helped to draft the Mental Deficiency Act in 1913. Get a load of that one, the Mental Deficiency Act. He will accept Parliament's passage of it, but without sterilization. In other words, taking people who are mentally deficient and putting them in a facility instead of sterilizing them. Keep in mind, eugenics was becoming the rage here already in the United States. By 1909, 1910, the state we live in, Connecticut, was one of the first 4 states to begin to sterilize people who were habitual criminals, mentally deficient, if you want to use that term. and that won't end until the early 1960s. It was they had 6 centers in the state of Connecticut. That's a different talk. But at this point, when the First World War starts, Churchill will eventually become First Lord of the Admiralty. And he is the man who plans or helps to plan the Gallipoli operation into Turkey in 1915. Keep in mind what you're seeing here in the First World War. When the war starts by August 4, 1914, everyone's saying the war will be over fast. The war will be over soon. The boys will be home by Christmas. You've heard that saying before. You heard that with Korea. The question is, which Christmas? That's the question. Of course, Lenin was one of those who said and who warned years before 1914, the next war will not be one of these short, sharp wars over territory. It is going to be a long war. It is going to be an industrialized war. It'll be fought by the capitalists, waged by the workers. He is right about the effect. This is going to be a long, long war, but it'll be an industrialized war. He's exactly right, because that's where the world is going. Industrialized, corporatized, commercialized war. If you don't have a factory and you don't have oil, don't even bother showing up. But you are at the point in history at this stage where war now a large conventional war now means you have to conscript not only your entire economy, but your entire population for war. And that comes out of the French Revolution. August 1793, Lazare Carnot pronounced levée en masse during the Great French War. And it accentuates and it snowballs afterwards ever since. And you will see this on steroids from 1939 to 45, especially with the United States and the Soviet Union, the only 2 countries that are able to wage this sort of war. Germany could not, Italy could not, Japan could not. So it's interesting how the globe is changing. However, Churchill's notion here, and he's correct, that with the stalemate on the Western Front, how do we keep Russia in the war? We need to open up an avenue in the Near East or Middle East and get into Russia and supply them. That was one of the major reasons for the Gallipoli operation, besides knocking Turkey out of the war. There's one problem with that. It descends into that stalemate of trench warfare. And Russia will not be supplied through Turkey, and Turkey will remain for the rest of the war. And so Churchill is going to be fired here because of the fact, his plan didn't work. And he will wind up back in the army on the Western Front. He will make 36 forays into no man's land. He has to, he thinks, rehabilitate himself, get out of the doghouse. He also becomes later Secretary of State, Secretary of Air. He's now going to be a big proponent of air power. But at the same time here, interesting, he's attached to the Colonial Office once the war is over with. The British here and the French, if you take a look at what we call the Middle East today, those countries, except for Saudi Arabia is the only country put together by Arabs in this period. The only one. The other countries, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Transjordan, later Jordan, Palestine as it was erected, were all because this event from the Sykes-Picot Agreement on to the Treaty of Lausanne of July 24, 1923, where the British and the French drew those borders through clannish associations, tribal affiliations, religious differences, and ethnic passions. And these borders were drawn by the British and the French for their colonial aspirations, not for the betterment of these people. And you don't think you're not going to have a problem. And guess who's the beneficiary of that situation? You are. One of the reasons you're there is because of major reason is because of the oil. That's why you're there in defense of the dollar. You took over the British Empire after 1945, whether you wanted to or not. That was one of the lots of life for you in American foreign policy. We took control of the British Empire because there's nobody else to make sure the West remains on top. We had to do it. No one else could. That's what's coming. But that's what happened in 1916 through 1918, 21, and 23. And at the same time here, interesting, Churchill, when they were You know, the Iraqis are going to rise up here in 1920. They'll be put down in 1921. But Churchill was one of those who didn't know the difference between a Sunni and a Shia. I mean, where are you going here if you don't know the difference between Sunni and Shia in the Islamic religion? You're not going far. You're going to retard your ability to understand here. However, interestingly enough, you know, when the first what we call the First World War is over, Churchill will remain in government. He will actually eventually become Chancellor of the Exchequer. And in 1925, going into 1926, he favors putting the pound on the gold standard, which will not work because as industrialization continues, you know, how do you broaden your economy when your currency is tied to only so much per value of gold? You know, the printing press has to be turned on here a little bit, you know. And interesting, before the states here became colonies, some of the colonies, which is why the British Crown passed the Currency Act of 1764, they didn't want the colonies printing their own money. Some of the colonies were pretty good at this. They'd print as much money as they needed to generate economic interaction. Once inflation started, they cut back on the currency to cool down the economy. That has to be done. You know, you have got to watch how that works. So there's really no value to the currency, but really in the end, it doesn't matter because what happens in 1929, the Depression, and a lot of these countries go into the tank. The United States was helping to keep Germany afloat. We can't keep Germany afloat anymore. We have to protect ourselves here. And what is that going to lead to on January 30, 1933? Adolf Hitler. But it's interesting here, the Versailles Treaty. And I'm going to mention that real quick because I think I have to. The Versailles Treaty is one of the biggest frauds ever perpetrated on modern man. If the British and the French were really enamored with democratic principles, especially the French here, they wanted reparations, then why didn't they help the Weimar Republic really get established in Germany? So they could have a democratic style of state, and so maybe there would not have been a Hitler, or even the rise of the communists. That doesn't happen. And so by 1933, Hitler comes to power. Of course, as I mentioned, there is no World War I or World War II. There's only the Great War, which is 1914, 1922, 1931, 1945. And in 1931, the Japanese invade Manchuria. Hitler comes to power. Churchill at this point is out in the political wilderness. He's writing, he's painting, but he will get back in Parliament. And as he gets back in Parliament, interesting here, there is a movement in the British Parliament to give more home rule to India. He's dead set against it. He's also against the abdication of Edward VIII. Remember, he wanted to marry a commoner and was willing to give up his access to the throne. And Churchill was against that. He's not very popular in certain quarters, yet at the same time, he's one of those who by the early to mid-1930s is alerting to the danger of what's happening on the continent. Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. Now I find this fascinating because the three who make up the Grand Alliance, the leaders, Winston Churchill, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Joseph Stalin. Stalin also understood that the Versailles Treaty was the biggest fraud ever perpetrated on modern man because he knew another war was coming. And this is the man who will forcefully industrialize the Soviet Union beginning in 1927. This is a country that up to this point, 90% of its people are peasants. Not when Joe gets done with it. He will collectivize the peasant, whether they want to be collectivized or not. He will pinch a lot of their grain and livestock. He's going to sell that overseas to bring in hard currency, bring in American, British, and French engineers, and start building a factory system. He will concentrate on heavy industry at the expense of civilian goods, tractors, machine tools. He will, throughout the 1930s, purge the Bolshevik Party for many who don't go along with this program. That's part of what he's doing here. But at the same time, by 1941, 1942, the Soviet Union is the world's second-ranking industrial power. And Soviet industrial production is one of the biggest keys for Allied victory in the Second World War. In fact, Lend-Lease will only be 10 or 12% of the Soviet effort. They will do this largely on their own, defeating the German army. And they're the ones that defeat the German army. We don't. Even Churchill said it was the Soviet army that tore the guts out of the German army. Churchill, in the meantime, in the 1930s, interesting, Britain signs a naval agreement with Germany, giving Germany access to building 35% of what British naval tonnage is. That's against the Versailles Treaty. There's also an escape clause in this agreement, where the Germans can build up to, they can build up to 45% of British naval tonnage, but if they give Britain a 6-month notice, they can build up to 100% of British submarine tonnage. And, and also Adolf Hitler unveils the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, again against the Versailles Treaty. And so as you begin to see the 30s wind down here, many of Churchill's warnings, and guess who else understood this too? Franklin D. Roosevelt. Stalin knew another war was coming all along, but it's Churchill. Franklin D. Roosevelt, though, does not have the freedom of movement Stalin did. Although, let's understand something. In 1935, the first B-17 flies, B-17 Flying Fortress. 1937, the first of America's new fast battleships are laid down in American shipping yards. 1939, the first B-24 Liberator flies, another heavy bomber like a B-17, but with a longer range. In 1940, Congress authorizes the Essex-class aircraft carriers. You see what's happening here? As you go through the 30s into the 1940, 41, Roosevelt's putting people to work here. And that's what's going to really get us out of the Depression in the end here. Because between 1939 and 1941, Roosevelt puts 8 to 10 million Americans back to work. That's not shabby. But what are they making? A lot of this is what? War goods. We're getting closer to joining this war. Churchill, by the way, got to be first Sea Lord. And it's his job to see to the British Navy. And he's responsible for a plan that he wanted implemented in early 1940. This would have called for the invasion of Norway. Keep in mind, the Soviets had gone to war with Finland after they divided up Poland with the Germans. November 30, 1939, it's called the Winter War. They do not do good in the beginning, but they finally crush the Finns. They take slices of territory away from Finland. While this is going on, Churchill had the idea that an Anglo-French army could be landed at Narvik in northern Norway, march across Norway in violation of Norwegian neutrality, go across Norway into Sweden, march across Sweden to help the Finns. And that would have put the British and the French at war with the Soviets and the Germans. How would that have changed history? Interesting, huh? Interesting. Another reason why Churchill wanted to invade Norway, because some of the iron ore that Sweden was selling Nazi Germany was being shipped out of Narvik. And German transports were hugging the Norwegian coast to get to Germany, so they wouldn't have to sail to sea and be intercepted by the British Navy. Now, Churchill is arguing here that, well, they're allowing the Germans to violate Norwegian neutrality, so why can't we just march in the Narvik? The problem here is Hitler's going to beat them to the punch. And on April 9, 1940, Hitler seizes Denmark and then attacks Norway. The British have to react. The Luftwaffe is able to set up air bases in Norway, and they are able to beat the Royal Navy. Why? Because Norway's a floating aircraft carrier. May 10, 1940, Hitler attacks the West, France and the Low Countries. Hitler stated, even boasted, the next war will not be fought like the last war because of the tank and the airplane. And many people thought the Germans were going to get stuck here for months, maybe even years again. He will humble France in 6 weeks, and the world is stunned. You know, the Germans were fighting to the timetable of 1940, as opposed to the French, who were fighting to the timetable of 1914. And of course, with Dunkirk, the British are able to evacuate over 335,000 Allied troops, mostly British and some French from France. But then France is going to fall. Norway, though, falls to the Germans. This was Churchill's plan. And some people begin to allude to the fact here that because on May 10, 1940, the day Hitler attacks France and the Low Countries, Neville Chamberlain will no longer be the prime minister. Many wanted Lord Halifax. Halifax was considered safe. Some thought now Churchill. There were some who thought that Winston Churchill should not be the prime minister because he could do some of the most outlandish things. Gallipoli was one thing. Norway was another. Yet, let's understand something. Britain, he helped to invent the tank. He was also a big opponent of what the Germans and Italians were doing in the 1930s. So, you know, and plus Churchill's experience in government. But at the same time here, there were many that thought that maybe at the time of Britain's history, some thought that when the country is at its direst time, you don't put your fortunes in a man who might do some of the most extraordinary of things. Yet the king sends for Churchill. Churchill will be made prime minister. And I remember J.R. Colville, who was secretary to Chamberlain, was secretary to Churchill. And he says, all of a sudden the pace picked up. Churchill was going here, going there. He went to France several times before it fell. Of course, the King of England, George VI, once the French fell, made a comment. He says, at last we have no more allies to pamper. You're by yourself. There's no one to help you. Churchill would see to even seeing some of the blockhouses and defenses building in England. And he understood that the British Army lost a lot of their equipment in Dunkirk. But he has help here, a man by the name of Lord Beaverbrook, who's his Minister of Armaments. And it's Beaverbrook who will make sure that those Hurricanes and Spitfires will be built in the numbers that they need to defend Britain during the Battle of Britain. In fact, Lord Beaverbrook's son, Max Aiken, will be flying a Spitfire and becomes an ace during this battle. And he said, and Max Aiken once made a remark that while I was flying them, my father was building them. But they hang on. And Churchill, is that, his speeches, their finest hour, which is one of the most remarkable of speeches. Never on the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few, meaning the RAF pilots. And there were more than just British here. There were Canadians, there were South Africans. There was even an Israeli. Well, the British called him an Israeli, a Jewish pilot flying for the RAF here. Some Czechs, some Poles. The Poles really have it in for the Germans because of what they did to Poland. And so and there was actually a group of Americans flying with the RAF. They'll be known as the Eagle Squadron, almost like Lafayette Escadrille in France on the Western Front in the First World War. But the British will hold on, and a lot of this is Churchill's speeches, rousing the people. His speeches, the way he used the English language was a weapon. And that weapon, his molding of the English language was every bit as effective as any bomb, bullet, or torpedo that the British Armaments Ministry produced in the entire war. He will become much closer to Franklin D. Roosevelt. 1940, 1941. And all through this period, and this gets kind of left out of the mix here, a number of conferences occur here between the American military staff and the British military staff. This has been going on since 1938. And interestingly enough, you see the two worlds begin to come together. It's in January 1941 that the Japanese begin planning Pearl Harbor. That same month, folks, up in Quebec, the American and British command staffs are meeting. And it's here they agree that if America gets into the war, this is January 41, how do you spell this word? W-H-E-N? It's really when, but it comes out if, that Hitler and Nazi Germany will be considered the major threat and Japan will be considered the secondary threat. I've seen an interview with Vannevar Bush. If any of you are not familiar with him, he was part of Roosevelt's economic staff and helped plan the American economy for the war. And he mentions this conference in January 1941 in Quebec. And he said the commanders were there and they made that announcement. And he said it was agreed that Hitler and Germany would be considered the major threat. You know what he said about the Japanese? It's fascinating. He said, those Japs, we can take care of them in our own good time. That's how he came out with this in this interview I saw. Interesting. And so as the war proceeds, one of the big aspects that happens here, January 22nd, 1941, Adolf Hitler throws 3,300,000 troops against the Soviet Union. The Great Patriotic War, as Stalin calls it, is on. And this will be the decisive land campaign for the entire Second World War. The land war will not be one in the Pacific. It will not be one in the desert. Sicily, Italy, even France. Even after Normandy, France is a secondary front. The main event on land from June 22nd, 41 to May 7, 1945 is the Eastern Front. End of discussion. On the Western Front, you had battles with thousands of men and hundreds of tanks. On the Eastern Front, it's millions of men with thousands of tanks. And the Soviets are going to win this. And I mentioned before, even though Britain and the United States will help the Soviet Union materially, most of what the Soviets produced with regards to weapons are Soviet weapons, and their weapons, their tanks in particular, are better than those Purple Heart boxes we were sending them. The Sherman tank being one of them, which the British used to call the Ronson Lighter. The T-34 was the best tank produced by the Allies during the entire war. In fact, Lend-Lease will be only 10 or 12% of the Soviet effort. Interesting fact, but it allows the United States to do almost everything else. This is a marriage made in heaven. Although don't say that to anti-communists in this country, they're not going to like that. But that's the way it was in 1941 to 45. But there's a problem here for the British, and Churchill understands this. He has a close working relationship with Roosevelt. But as the war goes on, Roosevelt's not stupid. He sees the way history is going. And it's only a matter of time before he becomes closer and closer to Stalin, from the perspective that he understands that when the war is over with, the Europeans are not going to be the determinants of power. Their days are numbered. It is ending here. It is going to be the United States and the Soviet Union. And this is really rammed home. This is really rammed home in the meetings. In November of 1943, the Tehran Conference. The Tehran Conference. And at Tehran, it is here that Churchill and Roosevelt tell Stalin that in May 1944, the Allied troops will finally attack Northwest Europe. That means France, the Normandy invasion. At the same time, Stalin says, that's fine, thank you very much. 2 weeks later, I will launch an offensive on the Eastern Front. Keep in mind, at this point of the war, November, December 1943, you've already had the Battle of Moscow, where Stalin stops Hitler at Moscow in December 1941. Stalingrad, Kursk. Kursk is the greatest air-land battle in the history of war. At one point, the Germans are losing 10,000 men a day here. You didn't see anything like this on the Western Front. Stalin knows he is the one doing 90% of the fighting, and the Russians are doing 90% of the dying here. He knows this. He's got a trump card with him at this meeting. He knows this. And so in June of 1944, the Allies will hit the beaches at Normandy, and Stalin will launch on June 22nd, 1944, Operation Bagration on the Eastern Front. And as one American general says, we are going to squeeze the Germans until the pips squeak. And that's exactly what they're going to do. But at the same time here, you know, the British are losing their ability to dominate affairs here. You saw this in 1944 and again at Yalta. Let's go to the Yalta Conference here, early February 1945. And Stalin has already occupied Eastern Europe. And he's not getting out of Poland. And Churchill does everything he can to get Stalin to get out of Poland. It's not going to work. Stalin's got 300 divisions in Eastern Europe. You're going to tell him he's got to leave? It's not going to work. And so even here, Churchill gets down to the extent, he says, if you don't get out of Poland, the Catholic Church, the Vatican, the Pope's not going to like this. The Pope's not going to like you're not leaving, because what are Poles? Catholic? Of course they are. And Stalin looks back at Churchill and says, how many divisions does he have? No army? Who are you? Stalin's not stupid. The Papal States are no longer a secular state. It's 108 acres, big deal. I got to be afraid of 108 acres? Where's his army? Pope's nothing. And so when the war is over with, yes, the Soviets will remain in Eastern and Central Europe. And that obviously begins the Cold War. But going back to what someone mentioned, I think, Keith, you mentioned earlier, yes, you see the destruction of the British here, really economically. And you go back to the First World War, this country, the United States, will ingest $908 million of the world's gold. The British have had $3.7 billion in assets and investments in this country in the First World War. That doesn't sound like a lot of money now, but it was then. They're going to have to liquidate 3/4 of that to pay for the war. The French will have to liquidate 3/4 of their investments and assets here to pay for the war. World War II. Britain was a country that in 1940 was a $16 billion creditor nation. In 1945, they're a $12 billion debtor. They only have $12 million in gold left. The United States has $29 billion in gold. 79% of the world's gold is in the United States because people had to pay for weapons with gold, or if they could get it, the US dollar. The transfer of power is astounding, and there's nothing Churchill can do about this. You know, it's Churchill's use of rhetoric and that bulldog face that helps bring the British back from 40 and 41. But the tides of history are running against England. And he will be voted out of office in 1945, and Clement Attlee will actually represent Britain at the Potsdam Conference, and Roosevelt is dead, and so who goes to the Potsdam Conference? Truman. And they will face off with Stalin. And this is where you see now Stalin's not going to be able to work with Truman. And so the Grand Alliance falls apart, hence the beginning of the Cold War. Churchill, by the way, will become prime minister again in 1951. And he will be prime minister until 1955, although partway through his term, he does have a stroke. After 55, he will remain in the British Parliament. And I always remember an old story that was told me by a British person from that era who was in the British military. He said there were a couple of young parliamentarians talking about Churchill, how old he was getting. Gee, it's a shame he can't see as much anymore. Yeah, I know, and he can't. He's having trouble speaking and getting around. You know, he's getting older. And there was an old man right behind them and says, yeah, and he can't hear too well anymore either. It was Churchill. He will die on January 24, 1965. And Queen Elizabeth II will accord him a state funeral, and it is a funeral that goes down in history as having among the most statesmen from other countries ever. I know that and I remember seeing the photos of this, de Gaulle here, all these other world leaders showing up, a lot of them war leaders from the past, military types going there for Churchill's funeral. But he left quite a legacy, and he's considered one of the Britons of all time. But he was the first of 8 people in the history of this country to be named an honorary American. He once said, and I'll leave you with this, he once said when he was addressing the Congress of the United States, late December 1941, when he was here staying with the Roosevelts, his mother being American, he said, chances are that if my mother had been a man and my father had been a woman, I would have been born here and I would have gotten here without having to take a boat or a plane. Interesting. His speech to Congress is really worth listening to. It's one of the best speeches ever given in our Congress. But of course, that's Churchill.